The sterile, cold hum of the machines was the first thing I heard when I woke up. But it wasn't the beeping or the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator that made my heart race. It was the realization that I could hear everything. I couldn't see, I couldn't move, but I could hear. And that was the worst part. I was supposed to be in a coma. The doctors said I would be unconscious, completely unaware of anything. They said I wouldn't feel a thing. But the truth is, I heard everything. Every whispered word. Every soft footstep on the tile floors. Every betrayal. I was fully aware of the hushed conversations between my husband and his accomplices, the legal documents they discussed, and the chilling plans they made. It wasn't just my body they were slowly dismantling. It was my life. It had all been carefully planned, calculated with a coldness that made my stomach twist. I could hear Michael's voice, low and steady, and I could picture the cruel smirk that must have been on his face. His fingers, the same ones that once traced patterns of affection on my skin, now tapped on the table with an unnerving rhythm. They're still keeping her sedated. We just need to keep it going for a bit longer, he said, his voice dripping with false concern. His words were casual, like he was discussing the weather. But underneath, I heard something darker. It was him, the man I had spent 15 years of my life with, plotting my death. Not in a moment of passion or anger, but with the same precision and cold calculation that he applied to every decision in our life together. A part of me wanted to scream, to shout, to wake up and confront him right then. But I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I lay there, my mind racing, trying to piece together everything I had just heard. My life, my legacy, my future. All of it was now in his hands, and I was utterly powerless. The nurse, Marie, came in a few moments later, her gentle voice a stark contrast to the bitterness I felt bubbling inside me. She adjusted the IVs and checked my vitals, speaking softly, almost as if I might wake up any second. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I felt my husband's hand on my arm. The same hand that had once been a comfort to me now felt like a weight. His touch was different now, heavy, almost possessive. "Everything's going to be okay," he whispered. "We'll make sure everything is taken care of. You don't have to worry about a thing." But I did worry. I worried because I knew what taking care of everything meant now. He had changed my will. He had transferred our joint accounts. He was selling the vacation house in Vermont. He had systematically dismantled everything I had worked for, everything we had built together. And in the process, he was preparing for my death. I wanted to scream, to break free from this prison of silence. But I couldn't. Not yet. "How long has it been?" I finally heard the nurse say, her voice almost playful. She had no idea the significance of her words. 3 months, Michael replied flatly. 3 months. And still no sign of improvement. But she'll wake up when the time's right. My heart skipped a beat. 3 months? That's how long I had been lying here, trapped in my own body. 3 months in which he had been planning, executing his betrayal with methodical precision. I wanted to rail against it, but I had to stay still. I had to remain in this fragile state, feigning unconsciousness for just a little longer. If I woke up too soon, I knew it would ruin everything. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of knowing I could hear him. I wasn't going to let him see that I was fully aware of his plans, of his cold betrayal. No, I would bide my time. The room fell silent for a moment. Michael's voice broke through the stillness again. "Once everything's in place, it'll be over. A little complication here, a small issue there, and she'll be gone. We'll make it look like an accident." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, but I couldn't react, couldn't flinch. I just had to remain silent. He was going to kill me, but I wasn't dead yet. I forced my mind to stay calm, to stay focused. I knew now what I had to do. I couldn't confront him directly. I couldn't let him know I was awake, but I could outsmart him. I would wait. The idea of revenge surged through me, sharper than any pain I had ever known. Michael thought I was helpless. He thought I was a pawn in his twisted game. But he was wrong. I wasn't just going to survive, I was going to expose him for what he was. And when I finally woke up, it would be his downfall. I just had to stay alive long enough to make it happen. Before everything fell apart, I thought we had the perfect marriage. At least, that's what I told myself every time I looked at Michael. I would catch him watching me across the dinner table, his eyes soft and warm, like he was still the man I fell in love with. But now, as I lie here in the silence of my hospital bed, I can't help but replay every moment, every interaction with him. And the more I think about it, the more I realize just how deep the deception ran. Started small, just like any other relationship, innocent enough. When we first met, I was drawn to Michael's confidence, his intelligence, the way he could walk into a room and command attention without saying a word. He had this effortless charisma that made people gravitate toward him, including me. We'd talk for hours, lost in our own world. He was my rock, always there when I needed him, supporting me through everything. My studies, my early career struggles, and the dreams I had for the future. In the beginning, Michael was everything I thought I wanted. He always knew the right thing to say, the right thing to do. He understood me better than anyone else. His praise felt genuine, and I was so blinded by love that I never questioned anything. I never questioned his constant care, the way he kept encouraging me to do things that ultimately benefited him as much as they did me. Take the first time he brought up the idea of updating our will. It was over breakfast, casual, almost as if it were no more significant than choosing what we would eat that day. "You're handling more high-risk patients now," he had said, buttering his toast with deliberate precision. "We should make sure everything's in order. You never know." At the time, I thought it was sweet. A bit morbid, sure, but he was concerned. He always was, or so I believed. I told him I'd think about it. After all, we had other priorities, my career, the research foundation, and taking care of my aging parents. But he didn't let it go. Weeks later, he brought it up again. And this time, I agreed. "It's a good idea," I said. "I should get that done." What I didn't know, what I couldn't see, was that he wasn't just looking out for our future. He was already laying the groundwork for his own. The more I think about it now, the more I realize how much of our life together was framed by his needs, his plans, his timing. He had always been the one to initiate changes, to suggest updates, to lead us into new ventures. And I, trusting him, never questioned it. But now, those moments replay in my mind like a film, each frame highlighting the manipulation that I missed. Like the time he suggested we sell the vacation house in Vermont. "It's a lot of property for just the two of us," he had said, as though the house we dreamed of owning together was just another commodity. "Maybe we should downsize, focus on other investments. Things that can make a real difference for the foundation." His argument was logical, well thought out, as always. And so, like every other suggestion he made, I followed along without hesitation. I didn't see that this wasn't just about our future, it was about his. The house was sold soon after, its proceeds disappearing into the accounts I was never fully allowed to control. I wish I could say I had known. I wish I could say I saw the signs earlier, but I didn't. It wasn't until I lay here in this hospital bed, hearing the steady rhythm of the monitors, that it all clicked. Michael wasn't just the man I married. He was a man who had been quietly building his own empire at my expense. I remember how he always seemed to have the right words, how he would brush off any concerns I had with a smile and a joke. When I argued about putting too much money into my research foundation, he'd nod thoughtfully and say, "I understand, but maybe we should diversify a little, invest in something with more immediate returns." And I would relent. Now, I see it for what it was. He wasn't looking out for our future. He was looking out for himself. All those late nights he spent at the office, all those times he'd disappear for hours, they weren't just business. They were plans to strip me of everything I had worked for. And I was too blind to see it. But I can see it now. Every moment of hesitation, every time I excused his behavior, all of it becomes clear. The first time he suggested we update the will, the way he never questioned where the money was going or why he needed so much access to it, all of it was a setup. He had always been testing me, testing how easily I could be controlled. And now, as I lie here unable to speak, I realize that I had been the perfect mark. Trusting, naive, believing that everything Michael did was for us. For the future we had talked about, the future he had already planned for himself. But what hurts the most What stabs deepest into my heart is how easily I was fooled, how much I loved him, how I believed in us. I always thought we had the perfect marriage. But now, I see it for what it really was, a carefully constructed illusion, designed to hide the lies, the greed, and the betrayal that he had been cultivating for years. Before I continue, and reveal how the pieces of this puzzle finally began to fall into place, I want to take a moment to connect with you, my amazing viewers. I know some of you have experienced betrayal in ways you never saw coming. Drop a comment below and tell me, where are you watching from today? Let me know your country's flag, and if you've ever had to fight for what you believed in, hit that like button, because this story is just getting started, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The days that followed blurred together, each moment slipping into the next with the haunting stillness of my body and the chaos of my thoughts. But in the silence, something began to shift. At first, it was a faint recognition in the hum of the machines, the steady beep of the heart monitor, the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. I had always been aware of those sounds, but now they felt different. They became my anchor, each beep synchronizing with my carefully controlled breath, maintaining the illusion of unconsciousness. But my mind was sharp. The fog that clouded my consciousness had lifted, and with it came the crushing weight of my realization. I could hear everything. I could hear the nurses, the doctors, even the faintest whispers of conversations, some too soft for anyone else to catch. I could hear Michael's voice. It always seemed to linger longer, the way he spoke to me, and the way he spoke about me. It was one of those evenings when I first realized just how deep his betrayal ran. The door opened slowly, the faint creak of hinges barely perceptible. Michael stepped into the room, his footsteps muffled by the sterile carpet. There was a shift in the air, a tension I could feel even in my immobile state. His voice, low and careful, carried across the room. "Everything's still under control," he said, his tone strained, like he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "I need to know if there's anything else we should do. I can't afford any mistakes." His words hung in the air, and a knot twisted in my stomach. The weight of what I was hearing finally hit me. He was preparing to kill me, but he was more concerned with covering his tracks than with any semblance of remorse. He wasn't just waiting for me to die. He was planning everything, controlling every detail. I wanted to scream, to shout at him, to tell him I knew everything, that I had heard it all. But I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I focused on staying still, forcing my mind to stay calm as I listened. My breath, controlled and even, continued to match the rhythm of the machines. Every beat of my heart, every subtle twitch of my muscles, was a performance. I wasn't just playing dead. I was waiting for the right moment, for the perfect time to expose the truth. Any sign of improvement? A second voice, soft but sharp, entered the room. It was Elena's voice. Her voice always seemed to drip with sweetness, like honey, except it had no warmth, just cold calculation. "No," Michael replied, his voice softer now, almost tender. "Still no change. The doctors say it's just a matter of time. But I'm not taking any chances." His words hung in the air with finality. I wanted to lash out. I wanted to scream at Elena for being part of this twisted plan. I wanted to call her out, to tell her I knew she was in on it. But I stayed silent, listening, recording every word, every shift in tone. I needed to remember every detail, every slip, every mistake they made. "The transfer should go through soon," Michael continued, his voice tinged with impatience. "We just need to make sure everything's lined up for the complication. I don't want anyone raising questions about the will or the money." I wanted to puke, the bile rising in my throat, but I held it down. I couldn't give them any sign that I was aware. Not yet. Not when I was so close. I had to be careful. They thought I was unconscious. They thought I was weak. They had no idea that while they were playing their game, I was making mental notes, cataloging every word, every movement. Elena's laughter broke the tension, a soft, almost mocking sound. "You're sure this is foolproof?" she asked, her voice laced with something darker than concern. "I don't want to be left holding the bag if something goes wrong." It's foolproof, Michael assured her. You have the papers, right? The new will is all set. Everything is in order. Once it's filed, it's over. No one will question a thing. I clenched my fists inside my mind. They were so confident. They thought they had everything figured out. They didn't know I was already gathering my evidence, assembling my case, step by step, silently from this bed. Every whispered conversation, every slip-up, was another piece of the puzzle I was building in my mind. And in that moment, I realized something else. Something that both terrified and fueled me. I wasn't just waiting for the right moment to expose Michael and Elena. I was preparing to take back everything they thought they had stolen from me. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about revenge. But there was one thing I needed to be sure of before I made my move. I needed to know who I could trust, and who was going to betray me next. I had to keep my enemies closer, but my allies, if there were any, closer still. The room was still, but the silence was thick with tension. I remained perfectly still, my eyes closed, my body motionless, pretending to be the helpless patient they believed I was. But inside, my mind was racing, piecing together every detail, every fragment of their conversation. I could hear the soft scrape of the door as it opened again, the footsteps echoing on the cold tile floor, slow and deliberate. Michael's voice came first, smooth and practiced, the one he used when he wanted to seem concerned, the one that had fooled so many. "We need to move quickly," he said, his tone low but edged with impatience. "The doctors are getting suspicious. The longer she stays like this, the more questions people will ask." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't react. Couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I forced my breathing to stay even, my pulse steady, masking the fury that was building inside me. I had heard enough. They were talking about my death again. They had been discussing it like it was nothing more than a formality, a business transaction. "Just a few more days," Michael continued, the sound of paper shuffling following his words. "Once we move the money, everything will be in place. And then, well, then we can let her go. The complications will take care of themselves." His voice dropped lower, and I could hear the faintest edge of excitement in his words, as though he couldn't wait to finish the job. I could feel the room closing in on me, the weight of their conversation, their plans, suffocating me. But I couldn't react. I couldn't give them any sign that I was awake, that I knew what they were planning. My life, my entire future, was hanging in the balance, and all I could do was listen as they plotted my death with such casual indifference. "How soon can we get everything done?" Elena's voice interrupted, sharp and cold. I could almost picture her standing there, hands on her hips, her expression calculating. "The longer we wait, the riskier it gets. You know that, right?" Michael's voice was almost absent as he replied, "I know. I'll handle it. Just make sure the paperwork is ready. Everything has to be signed by the time the transfer goes through." There was a pause, a moment of silence that felt like an eternity. Then, I heard a sound I never expected, the soft rustle of a kiss. A kiss. It was so intimate, so personal, and yet so detached from anything I had ever known in my marriage. I wanted to scream, to tear the world apart in that instant. But I stayed still. I had to. "Once the will is processed," Michael murmured, his voice almost too low to hear. "Once everything's legally in place, she won't be able to stop us. We'll be set. The house, the foundation, everything, all ours." Their words hit me like cold water, but they did something else, too. They fueled a fire inside me, one that I had buried deep, one that was now burning hotter than ever. They thought they were in control, that I was powerless. But they couldn't have been more wrong. They were underestimating me, just as they had for years. "I can't believe it's come to this." Elena's voice broke the silence again, a trace of unease creeping into her tone. "You've been so careful. But if we're caught?" "We won't be caught." Michael cut her off sharply. "Everything's lined up. It's foolproof. No one will ever know what really happened. And by the time anyone figures it out, it'll be too late." The arrogance in his words, the certainty with which he spoke, almost made me sick. But it also made me stronger. He was right about one thing. By the time anyone figured out the truth, it would be too late. But it wasn't going to be him getting away with it. As the conversation drew to a close, I heard their footsteps fading, their voices growing quieter, but the weight of their words stayed with me. They thought they had already won. They thought my death was inevitable. But what they didn't know, what they could never have predicted, was that I was already planning my comeback. I wasn't just surviving in this bed. I was waiting. Every word, every piece of their plan was another weapon I could use against them. They thought they had control, but they had no idea that I was already taking back the power. I lay there, the hum of machines my only company, as memories flooded my mind, each one clearer than the last. As much as I hated to admit it, the signs had been there all along. They were scattered through our life together. Like breadcrumbs I had been too blind to follow. I had always considered myself a logical person. Someone who analyzed, who saw patterns, who looked for evidence. But when it came to Michael, I had ignored every red flag, every small piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. I remembered the early days of our marriage, the moments when everything felt so right, when Michael was the man I had always dreamed of. Our wedding, the vows we exchanged, the first house we bought together. It all felt like a fairy tale. At least, that's what I had convinced myself of. In those moments, I never questioned anything. I never questioned his motives, his long hours at the office, or his growing need to control every aspect of our lives. The first sign that something might be off came years ago, though I didn't recognize it for what it was at the time. It was during one of our routine conversations about the future, about the foundation I had poured my heart and soul into. Michael had always been supportive, at least that's how I saw it. But now, looking back, I can see how subtly he was testing the waters. "You've been doing well with the foundation," he had said, his voice smooth, like it was just another casual conversation. "But have you ever thought about diversifying? Maybe focusing on something more tangible? Something with a faster return?" I had laughed it off, thinking it was just Michael being Michael, always thinking about the next big thing, always planning, always analyzing. But now I realized what he was really doing. He wasn't just concerned about the future of my work. He was concerned about his future. He had already started planting the seeds of doubt, planting the idea that my passion for the foundation might not be enough. He wanted to make sure I would abandon it, or at the very least, allow him to have a hand in its financial control. I remember the way he'd downplayed my achievements, the way he'd made it seem like my work wasn't as important as his career. He'd never overtly belittled me, but he didn't have to. It was in the little things, the subtle shifts in his behavior, the way he would dismiss my accomplishments with a smile, the way he would suggest that we focus on building wealth in other areas. And every time I'd find myself justifying it, excusing his behavior, thinking that maybe he was right. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I let him do it. I let him take control of the decisions that should have been mine. I let him dictate the course of our future, and in doing so, I gave up pieces of myself along the way. The first time he mentioned revising my will, I was so busy with work and the foundation that I didn't question it. He had always been the practical one, the one who thought about logistics and finances while I focused on my patience, on my research. "You know, it's a good idea to have everything in order," he said one evening, his voice casual, as though it was just another task to check off the list. "You never know what might happen. We should make sure everything's split up fairly." At the time, it seemed so reasonable. I trusted him. I trusted him more than anyone in the world. I was so consumed with my work, with the foundation that I loved, that I didn't even question why he was suddenly so concerned with our finances. Why hadn't we talked about this before? Why had I never felt the need to address it? But he made it seem so simple, so necessary. So I agreed. And just like that, he had planted another seed of doubt in my mind. A seed that would grow into something far darker, far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. The changes he made to my will, the changes to our finances, they all seemed insignificant at the time. But in reality, they were the first steps of a carefully orchestrated plan. A plan to take everything from me. As I lay in this hospital bed, my body still, but my mind racing, I realized just how deeply he had buried his manipulations into our life. The late nights at the office, the secretive phone calls, the way he would guard his laptop and phone with an almost obsessive intensity. They had all been signs I had overlooked. I had dismissed them as nothing more than the demands of his job, the pressure of his work. But now I saw it for what it truly was. A web of deceit he had been weaving for years, and I had been too trusting to see it. I thought back to the last time we had gone to Vermont to our vacation home. Michael had been distant, distracted, constantly checking his phone, even during dinner. I had assumed it was work, that he was just busy with emails or meetings. But now I knew it wasn't work at all. It was something else, something darker. He had been rehearsing for the role of the loving husband, rehearsing for the role of the man who would mourn me when I was gone. His kindness, his affection, it had all been an act, and I had fallen for it. Every smile, every gesture of love had been rehearsed. The way he held me when I cried, the way he whispered sweet words in my ear, it had all been a performance. He had played the role of the devoted husband so well that I never saw the lies hiding beneath. I had trusted him completely. I thought about the last time he had asked me to look at our finances together. "We should consolidate some of our accounts," he had suggested, his voice smooth, casual. "Streamline things, make them more efficient." Again, I hadn't questioned him. I had trusted him. He was always the practical one, always thinking ahead. But now I realized that was all part of the plan. He had been preparing for this moment for years, gradually pulling the strings, manipulating every situation to his advantage. He had been methodical, patient. I was only starting to see how far back this had gone, how deeply he had buried his manipulation into every aspect of our lives. How many times had I thought he was just being careful with our money, our future? How many times had I believed his explanations, his justifications, when in reality, he had been setting the stage for my downfall? And yet, as I lay here, still and silent, I couldn't help but feel a sense of power growing inside me. The pieces were coming together, the puzzle was almost complete. I had been blind, yes, but I wasn't blind anymore. I was awake now. I was aware. And more than that, I was ready. Days blurred into weeks, and the sterile smell of antiseptic became the only constant in my world. I lay there, my body immobilized, my mind alert, waiting. The stillness of my body was my greatest weapon, a silent act of survival. But beneath the surface, I was far from still. Each passing hour was filled with quiet, calculated movements, tiny adjustments that no one could notice, but that were slowly laying the groundwork for what was to come. I focused on my breathing. The rhythm of the ventilator became my companion, its artificial breaths matching my own, mimicking the sound of life. I synced my heartbeat with the slow beeps of the monitor, letting the steady pulse of technology lull everyone into a false sense of security. They thought I was still unconscious, trapped in the void of a coma. But I wasn't. Not anymore. The more time passed, the clearer it became that Michael was growing more desperate. His visits became more frequent, but there was a nervous edge to his movements. His touch, once tender, had now turned possessive, like a man trying to hold onto something he could feel slipping away. He would sit by my bed, his hand resting on mine, speaking softly to me, telling me how much he missed me. But his words were hollow. I could hear the cracks beneath his facade, the strain in his voice as he waited for the moment I would slip away completely. The first time I moved, just a slight twitch of my finger, it was as if the world stopped. My hand, stiff from days of immobility, twitched involuntarily. The moment was so small, so fleeting, that I thought I had imagined it. But then I saw it, the faint flicker of recognition in Michael's eyes. He hadn't noticed, not completely, but the flicker was enough. The faintest hint of doubt crossed his face, as if he were questioning the reality of my condition. It was a moment of triumph, but I couldn't show it. Not yet. I had to be patient. I couldn't risk letting him know that I was aware, that I was already planning my next steps. Instead, I focused on those small moments, tiny, deliberate actions that no one else would see. A deep breath at the right moment, a twitch of my fingers, a flutter of my eyelids. I practiced them endlessly, honing them until they became instinctual. I needed to make sure that when the time came, I would be ready. And then there was Katie, the night nurse. At first, I wasn't sure if she had noticed anything. She came in and out of the room, doing her rounds with a professional detachment that seemed almost robotic. But over time, I began to notice things, small gestures that didn't align with the typical clinical approach. She lingered by my side longer than necessary, her fingers brushing mine just a fraction of a second longer than expected. I wasn't sure at first, but the more I observed, the more it became clear. Katie wasn't just doing her job. She was paying attention. One night, when the room was quiet, I felt her touch again. It was subtle, just a soft graze of her fingers against my hand. But this time, it wasn't just a touch, it was deliberate. She slipped a small piece of paper beneath my hand, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something other than the cold, unfeeling grasp of this hospital room. A flicker of hope. The note was brief, just a few lines scrawled in neat handwriting. I know you're awake. I'm watching. Be careful. Couldn't believe it. Someone had noticed. Someone was on my side. Katie had been my first real ally in this silent war, and I couldn't afford to waste the opportunity. I couldn't show any signs that I was awake, but the knowledge that there was someone in the hospital, someone who was paying attention, gave me the strength to keep going. Slowly, I began to trust her, inch by inch, building a delicate alliance in the shadows. As the days wore on, I began to gather more pieces of the puzzle. Conversations between Michael and Elena became less guarded. They thought I couldn't hear them, but I was listening, absorbing every word, every detail they let slip. Michael was careless, his facade beginning to crack under the pressure of his plan. I heard him speak to Elena one night, his voice filled with frustration. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," he said, his tone laced with anxiety. "She's supposed to be in a coma, but what if she wakes up? What if she remembers something? We have to make sure it's done soon." The words hit me like a jolt of electricity. He was getting scared. That was good. That meant he was starting to doubt himself, starting to question if his carefully laid plans were really as foolproof as he had convinced himself. It was a crack in his armor, and I was going to exploit it. But I had to be patient. I couldn't afford to act rashly, not when everything was so fragile. I kept my movements slow, deliberate, each one calculated to add weight to the illusion that I was still helpless. The more I waited, the more I realized that my recovery wasn't just about waking up. It was about gaining control, about using the information I had gathered to take back what was mine. Katie's visits became more frequent. She didn't just check my vitals or adjust my medications. She would stay and talk to me. Sometimes it was casual, other times more serious. I listened intently, soaking in every detail she shared. She told me about Michael's frequent visits, about his behavior, about how his anxiety was becoming more apparent. She told me that some of the nurses had started to notice the tension in the air, the way Michael was always hovering, always watching. At one point, she told me something that sent a chill down my spine. "He's been meeting with a lawyer," she said quietly, her eyes darting around to make sure no one was listening. "They're talking about your will, the changes he's made. I don't think anyone knows, but it doesn't look good, Sarah. You need to be careful." I had suspected it, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it real. Michael wasn't just planning my death. He was planning to take everything from me, to erase my existence from the world. But he had underestimated one thing, me. With Katie's help, I started to piece together a plan. I knew I couldn't move too quickly, couldn't reveal my awareness too soon. But with every conversation, every secret detail I overheard, I gained strength. I was gathering evidence, small fragments of a much larger picture. Every piece brought me closer to the truth. The hospital became my battleground, and I was no longer the passive, helpless patient. I was becoming something else, something stronger. I was a woman on the verge of reclaiming her life, her legacy, and her power. As the days passed, I began to realize that surviving Michael's betrayal, would require more than just silence. It would require allies, those who were willing to see beyond the surface, those who could be trusted even in the midst of all the lies. I had already taken the first step in gathering information, in watching Michael and Elena slip up, but now I needed to build the network that would turn my knowledge into power. Katie had been my first ally, but I knew I couldn't rely on her alone. As kind and attentive as she had been, I could tell she was walking a fine line. She had risked too much already by slipping me the note. She had given me a spark of hope, but I knew she wasn't in a position to do more without putting herself at risk. If Michael suspected her, she could be in danger, too. I needed to be careful, but I also knew that I couldn't keep everything to myself. I needed to reach out to others who might be in the right position to help, but also others who could be trusted not to betray me. I needed to build a network, a quiet army of people who could act without raising suspicion. So, as I lay in that bed, feigning unconsciousness, I began to plant seeds, small gestures that would let others know I wasn't as helpless as I appeared. It wasn't just about gathering allies from the hospital staff. I had to think bigger. Michael's network was vast, woven with connections that stretched beyond this sterile room. He had lawyers, financial advisors, and even shady associates who were likely involved in his plans. But just as he had surrounded himself with people who would aid him in his deceit, I had to find those who could see through the facade, who could be trusted to do what was right. The first person I decided to test was Dr. Chun, my attending physician. He had always been professional, distant, but there were moments when I sensed something more. He had an air of compassion that I hadn't seen in many of the doctors who had treated me. He listened intently, his eyes occasionally softening when he spoke to me. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me wonder if he could be someone I could trust. I focused on my recovery, deliberately taking small, measured steps. Each subtle twitch of my fingers, each slight flutter of my eyelids, was a calculated move to catch his attention without alerting anyone else. I didn't want to make it obvious, not yet, but I needed him to notice. I needed him to see that I was awake, that I was aware, and I needed to see if he would help. The first breakthrough came one afternoon. Dr. Chun was doing his rounds, checking my vitals with his usual efficiency. But this time, as he adjusted the 4-drip, I noticed him glance down at my hand. It wasn't a casual glance. It was sharp, deliberate, like he had seen something he hadn't expected. A flicker of recognition passed across his face, quickly hidden behind his professional mask. But I knew what I had seen. He had noticed. I didn't move. I held my breath, waiting. He finished his work, but before he left the room, he paused at the door, glancing back at me. "Sarah," he said softly, so quietly I barely heard it. "You're stronger than they think." Couldn't believe it. It was the first real sign that someone else knew what was going on. He hadn't said much, but those few words spoke volumes. It was a signal, a small, subtle gesture that showed me I wasn't alone in this. Dr. Chun was my second ally, whether he knew it or not. And from that moment on, I could trust him. But I couldn't stop there. I needed more. And the key to gathering more allies wasn't just in finding people who might be sympathetic to my cause. It was in learning who to trust, who could be counted on to stay quiet, to act when the time was right. And so I watched. I watched the other nurses, the ones who came and went without paying much attention, the ones who followed orders without question. But then there was Karen, a night nurse who had been with me almost as long as Katie had. Karen was quiet, observant, and there was something in the way she carried herself that made me think she might be different. She had a sense of calm, a kind of quiet resolve that was rare in the chaos of the hospital. I started to pay more attention to her, watching how she interacted with the others, how she moved through the room with a subtle grace that made her seem almost untouchable. One night, after the others had left, Karen came in to check my vitals. I had been practicing my movements, testing how much I could get away with. As she adjusted my pillows, she brushed my hand. Just a slight touch, just enough to let me know she was aware. And then, in the quietest of whispers, she said, "I've been watching. I know you're still here. I'm here for you, Sarah." It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was a confirmation. I wasn't alone. Karen had seen through the act, just like Katie and Dr. Chun. She was another ally, another piece of the puzzle that was slowly falling into place. I could feel the weight of her trust in me, and I knew that when the time came, she would be there to help. Over the next few days, I began to subtly communicate with Karen. Each time she came in, I let her know in small ways that I wasn't as helpless as I appeared. I would slightly adjust my fingers, flicker my eyelids, or even give the slightest nod when she spoke to me. It was a delicate game, a game of trust, but I could see the beginnings of something powerful forming. Karen, like Dr. Chun and Katie, was on my side. She wasn't just a nurse. She was part of my plan. And as the days turned into weeks, my circle of allies grew. I knew I couldn't rely on just one person, not in a situation like this. I needed more than just passive support. I needed people who would act when the moment was right, who would help me gather the evidence I needed to expose Michael and Elena for the criminals they were. Each conversation, each touch, each sign of trust was another piece of the puzzle. Slowly but surely, I was gathering the people I needed, the people who would help me take back control of my life. But I knew that it wouldn't be easy. Michael had surrounded himself with people who would protect him, who would cover up his lies. But that didn't matter. I had something he didn't. People who cared, who saw through the act, who wanted justice. The pieces were falling into place. And soon it would be Michael who would be trapped, not me. I had learned the hard way not to trust blindly. But now I was ready to use that trust to my advantage. The tension in the air was palpable, and with each passing day, I could feel Michael's anxiety growing. His visits to my room were becoming more frequent, and his once controlled demeanor was now fraying at the edges. His nervous energy was unmistakable, and though I couldn't move, I could sense it. His every restless glance, the slight tremor in his voice whenever he spoke to me. It was like a tightrope stretched too thin, and I knew he was on the verge of losing his composure. I listened carefully, watching for any signs of weakness, any crack in his perfect facade. And it didn't take long. One evening, just after the nurse had left, I heard Michael muttering to himself as he stood by my bedside. His words, though soft, were laced with frustration. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice strained. "What if she wakes up? What if someone notices? We're so close, but it's getting harder to keep up the act." I could feel the heat rise in my chest. He was scared. Scared of getting caught, scared of the house of cards he had built crumbling around him. And yet, the more desperate he became, the more mistakes he made. His actions, his words, were starting to unravel the very plan he had spent months carefully constructing. He had been so meticulous before, so confident in his ability to outsmart everyone. But now I could hear the desperation creeping in. He was slipping, and that was my opportunity. Every second he spent second-guessing himself brought me closer to the moment I had been waiting for. The moment when I would finally turn the tables on him. And then there was Elena. I could hear her in the hallway, her voice cutting through the quiet of the night like a knife. "We need to do this soon," she said, urgency thick in her tone. "The longer she stays like this, the more likely someone will catch on. We've already made some noise, and I'm not sure we can cover it up much longer." I knew Michael had been leaning on Elena more heavily, their conversations growing bolder, more direct. She was his partner in this crime, and I could hear the strain in her voice as she pushed him to act faster. She wanted everything done. No more waiting, no more slipping through the cracks. She was ready to finish it. It was the perfect storm. The desperation in Michael's voice, Elena's impatience, and the growing tension between them all signaled that they were losing control. And that was exactly what I needed. The trap was almost set. I focused on my recovery, subtly pushing my body to make just enough progress to appear plausible. Couldn't rush it, not yet. But with each small movement, each controlled breath, I knew I was inching closer to my moment of action. Michael was getting more comfortable, more careless. His confidence had been his strength, but now it was becoming his weakness. He had convinced himself that I was still the passive, helpless woman in the bed, that I was still unaware of his plans. But what he didn't know was that I was the one in control now. Every second I spent gathering information, every tiny piece of the puzzle, was bringing me closer to revealing everything. The breakthrough came one evening when Michael, unable to bear the mounting pressure, made a fatal mistake. I could hear him on the phone, his voice low and hushed, but the words still clear enough to hear. He was speaking to one of his financial contacts, someone I knew well from my own work with the foundation. "I need the transfer done," Michael said, his voice sharp. "Once it's in place, everything will be handled. Just make sure it goes through smoothly. If she wakes up, if anyone asks, we can't afford any delays." That was it. That was the slip-up I had been waiting for. Michael had given me the very thing I needed: proof. Proof that he was actively planning my death. Proof that the financial transfer was imminent. Proof that he believed he had everything under control. He thought he was untouchable. But he had no idea that I had been listening, that I had been gathering every piece of evidence, every detail, for weeks. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a strategist, a woman who had played the long game and was finally seeing her plan come to fruition. I didn't immediately react, though. I had to be smart, careful. The timing had to be perfect. Michael and Elena were getting impatient. They wanted everything wrapped up and soon. And I knew that once they moved, they would think they had won. They would think they had silenced me. But that's when the trap would close. I knew I couldn't trust anyone else. Not yet. But I also knew that Michael was already too far gone. He had made too many mistakes. His growing paranoia, his reliance on Elena, and his belief that I was still in a coma, these were his undoing. They had underestimated me, and they would pay the price. As I lay there, my mind buzzing with plans and strategies, I felt something shift within me. The sense of control, of power, was exhilarating. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel something other than fear. It was hope that justice was within reach. And then, just as I was about to make my move, I heard Michael's voice again, this time louder, more frantic. "We can't wait any longer," he said. "The doctors are talking about reducing her sedation. We have to move tonight. It's our last chance." The urgency in his voice was the final trigger. I could feel it in my bones. This was it. The trap was ready, and Michael had just walked right into it. I took a deep breath, the steady rhythm of the ventilator still syncing with my own pulse. I had played the long game, and now it was time to make my move. Slowly, deliberately, I began to shift my body, just enough to make a sound. My hand twitched, just the smallest motion. I felt the weight of the moment, the tension in the air. This was the moment I had been waiting for. As the days passed, the web around me grew tighter. Michael and Elena were more desperate than ever, but they were blind to the fact that their every move was being observed, every conversation recorded in the silence of my room. They believed they had control, that they could silence me forever. What they didn't know was that they were being watched by someone who had begun to see through their lies. Detective Morris. Detective Morris had been involved in the investigation from the start, though she had kept her distance, careful not to tip her hand too soon. I knew her name from the brief interactions I had overheard in my hospital room, but it wasn't until one fateful day that I realized she was working the case in ways I hadn't anticipated. She had been investigating Michael for months, piecing together the inconsistencies in his story, the gaps in the evidence. But it wasn't until I had gathered enough of my own that our paths truly crossed. One evening, just after Michael had left the room, I heard the soft click of the door as it opened again. This time it wasn't Michael or Elena, it was Detective Morris. Her voice was calm, controlled, but there was a hint of something else beneath it, a quiet determination. "I've been following up on some of the details from the accident report," she said, her tone almost casual, but I could tell she wasn't here to just make small talk. "There's something off about the way things were handled. Your husband's story. There's too much that doesn't add up." The words hit me like a rush of adrenaline. She knew. She was on to them. She continued, her voice lowering as she approached my bedside. "We've been reviewing the mechanics of your car, and we found some discrepancies with the brake system. It doesn't look like it was a simple malfunction. It looks like it was tampered with." I felt a surge of satisfaction rush through me, but I forced myself to remain still. The trap was tightening. Detective Morris was more involved than I had realized, and now it was becoming clear that she was beginning to connect the dots. She paused for a moment, as though weighing her next words. "The car service company that Michael recommended, it's come up before in other cases. Something doesn't feel right, Sarah. We're going to dig deeper. I could feel my pulse quicken in anticipation. This was it. Morris was not only investigating Michael, but she was starting to put the pieces together, just as I had been doing all this time. She was aligning herself with the truth, and with each step she took, she was closing in on Michael and Elena. But I wasn't ready to reveal everything yet. I couldn't afford to risk everything just because someone was on my side. I had to make sure Morris would be my ally when the time came to strike. As Morris turned to leave, she looked over her shoulder, her eyes meeting mine for the first time since entering. "You're not alone in this, Sarah. We're going to make sure you get the justice you deserve." Her words were firm, filled with conviction. The look in her eyes told me she wasn't just saying this to comfort me. She meant it. I felt a weight lift from my chest. Morris wasn't just investigating. She was becoming a key player in my plan. I didn't know how much she had already uncovered, but I knew one thing for sure. She was someone I could trust. From that moment on, our silent alliance was forged. I continued to gather evidence from my side, taking note of every small slip, every hint of panic in Michael's voice. Every time he spoke to Elena, every time he let something careless slip, I was listening. And now Morris was doing the same. She was piecing together the facts, and soon, she would have everything we needed to expose Michael's betrayal once and for all. But there was still one more step before we could make our move. Michael and Elena had been careful, too careful, but as their desperation grew, so did their mistakes. The trap was almost set, and Morris was going to be the key to delivering the final blow. We just needed one last piece of the puzzle, the evidence that would prove Michael's guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. It was only a matter of time. The moment had finally arrived. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, and Michael, in his arrogance, had walked right into the trap. He believed he had covered every angle, that he had outsmarted me, that my silence was nothing more than a death sentence waiting to be carried out. But he was wrong. I had been gathering the evidence, waiting for this moment where everything would come to light. I could feel the tension in the air as Michael entered the room, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, as if he were walking to his own execution. His usual calm demeanor was shattered. There was an anxiety in his every movement, a sense of urgency that I hadn't seen before. He paused by my bed, his hand hovering over mine, but his eyes never met mine. His gaze was fixed somewhere distant, somewhere dark, and I knew he was already preparing his escape plan in his mind, just in case things went wrong. He thought I was still the fragile woman he had kept captive in this hospital room. But today, I was different. Today, I was no longer the victim. I was the one in control. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice strained, barely audible. "You need to rest. Everything will be fine soon. You just need to hold on a little longer." He hadn't even noticed that I was awake. He hadn't seen that my fingers were twitching, that my eyes had opened just enough to catch every movement, every word. He hadn't seen the evidence I had been gathering, the silent witness that had been watching him all along. The door creaked open, and Elena stepped inside. Her smile was as cold as ever, the same calculated, confident smile she wore when she thought she had one. She knew nothing. She thought the game was over. The way she stood in the doorway, her posture relaxed, her arms crossed. It was as if she were waiting for an invitation to gloat. She had been the perfect accomplice, working behind the scenes, feeding Michael with the information he needed. But she had no idea that her part in this was about to come to an end. I could feel it, the final breath of suspense, the moment right before the storm broke. They were both here, Michael, Elena, and they thought they had won. They thought I was still trapped in my body, still at their mercy. But I was far from powerless. I had been waiting for them to make their move, to get too comfortable, to let their guard down. And now they were about to fall. Without warning, I made my move. Slowly, deliberately, I shifted my arm just enough for Michael to see. His eyes widened in shock as my fingers twitched, then curled. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. For the first time, he saw the truth. I was awake. I was aware. I had heard every word, every conversation. The truth had been unveiled. Elena's face went pale as she watched Michael's reaction. She stepped back instinctively, her eyes flicking from him to me, then back to him, trying to process what was happening. Her confident smile faltered for the briefest moment before she recovered, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. She had no idea what was coming. Michael's voice broke the silence, his usual composure slipping away as he stammered, "Sarah, you're awake? How long?" I took a deep breath, letting the full weight of the moment settle over me. I didn't need to say anything at first. The look on my face said everything. I had been awake for weeks, watching, listening, gathering every shred of evidence. And now the moment had arrived. The door swung open again, and Detective Morris stepped into the room, her presence commanding the space. Behind her, Karen entered, her face calm, but I could see the faintest hint of satisfaction in her eyes. They had been working together quietly, gathering the final pieces of the puzzle, making sure that when the time came, everything would be in place. "Michael Matthews," Detective Morris said, her voice sharp and steady. "You are under arrest for the attempted murder of your wife, Sarah Matthews, and for conspiracy to commit fraud and embezzlement. You've been running a scheme for months, and we have everything we need to bring you down." Michael's face drained of color as he looked from Morris to me, then back to Elena, who stood frozen in shock. The walls were closing in around him, and for the first time he saw the truth. There was no escape. His perfect plan, built on lies and deception, had crumbled. "You think this is over?" Elena snapped, her voice cold, defensive. "You think we're just going to let you ruin everything? You were already ruined the moment you chose greed over loyalty," I replied, my voice steady, even. "This is the moment you've been waiting for, Michael. You and Elena thought you could take everything from me, but I've been waiting for you to make a mistake. And now you have." Elena's eyes flicked between Michael and me, realization dawning in her expression. She took a step back, her arms crossed defensively, as if to protect herself from the truth that was now unraveling before her. "You don't know what you're doing," she spat. "You're just a pawn in this game, Sarah. You're nothing." "Not anymore," I said, my voice calm, but cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm the one holding the cards now." Morris stepped forward, her hand on Michael's arm, guiding him away from the bed. "Everything's been documented," she said, her voice low, almost pitying. "The altered will, the financial transfers, the phone calls, the evidence from your car. Everything you thought was buried is right here in black and white." Michael's eyes darted to the floor, his face a mask of panic and disbelief. He had underestimated me. He had underestimated everyone. And now it was over. "You're done," Morris said, her voice firm as she cuffed him. "The game's up, Michael." As Michael was led out of the room, his face a mixture of rage and disbelief, I couldn't help but feel a sense of calm wash over me. The battle was won, and the truth had been laid bare. For months, I had been a prisoner in my own body, forced to watch as the man I had loved turned into something unrecognizable. But now the tables had turned. Now it was him who was trapped in a web of his own making. Elena stood in the corner, her face tight with frustration, but she was trapped too. She knew it, I knew it, and soon everyone else would know it too. The truth had a way of coming out, no matter how deep you buried it. And now, it was Elena's turn to face the consequences of her actions. I sat back in my bed, the weight of everything finally lifting. I had survived. I had fought back. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what happened next, I had taken back control. The truth had set me free. The courtroom was silent as the door creaked open, and Michael walked in, his once pristine suit now wrinkled and worn. The arrogance that had once filled his every movement was gone, replaced with a palpable sense of dread. His shoulders slumped, and the confidence he had displayed during the weeks of his calculated plans seemed to have evaporated. For the first time in a long time, Michael Matthews was no longer in control. I sat there, watching him from across the room, my eyes steady and unyielding. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. The truth was now in the hands of the law, and the wheels of justice were turning. The entire web of deception that Michael and Elena had spun was about to unravel, and there was no escaping the truth now. The prosecutor stood, poised and confident, as the trial began. The evidence had been meticulously gathered, each phone call, each document, each financial transaction carefully laid out for the jury to see. The altered will, the fraudulent transfers, the tampered car, everything was there in black and white. Michael and Elena had thought they could bury the truth, but it had been unearthed, piece by piece, and now the consequences were catching up to them. The prosecutor began by presenting the evidence, each piece more damning than the last. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice clear and strong, "we are here today because of one simple truth. Michael Matthews attempted to murder his wife, Sarah Matthews, for financial gain. He manipulated her, deceived her, and ultimately tried to eliminate her from the picture. But he underestimated her. She fought back. She survived. And now, it's time for him to face the consequences of his actions." I watched as the jury listened intently, their expressions a mix of disbelief and anger. They had seen the evidence, heard the testimony, and they understood what was at stake. Michael's once polished reputation was crumbling before their eyes, and he had no one to blame but himself. The prosecutor went on, detailing how Michael had altered the will, changing the beneficiaries to ensure that everything would go to him, leaving Sarah's parents, her foundation, and her legacy in the dust. He described how Michael had siphoned off funds, made transfers, and even gone so far as to tamper with Sarah's car, all to secure his financial future. The case was airtight, and there was no room left for doubt. But then came the moment that took the wind out of Michael's defense. The prosecutor turned to the detective, who stood up and testified about the investigation into Sarah's accident, the inconsistencies in Michael's story, and the evidence that had led to his arrest. Detective Morris explained how she had worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, following every lead, connecting every dot. "This wasn't just an accident," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "This was a carefully orchestrated plan. A plan to kill Sarah and take everything she had worked for. But the truth has come to light, and now it's time for Michael Matthews to answer for his crimes." Michael's defense attorney tried to push back, attempting to cast doubt on the evidence, to question the timeline, to suggest alternative explanations. But every attempt to deflect was met with another piece of irrefutable proof. The jury wasn't swayed. They saw through the lies, saw the truth for what it was. And then, in the most pivotal moment of the trial, I took the stand. I could feel the weight of the room on me as I walked up to the witness stand. The eyes of the jury, the defense, the prosecution, all on me. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was about reclaiming my life, my legacy, my strength. Michael had taken so much from me. My trust, my safety, my peace. But now it was my turn to take back what was mine. The prosecutor asked me to recount what had happened during the days and weeks leading up to the accident. I spoke clearly, without hesitation, describing the moments when I began to suspect something was wrong, the way Michael had subtly manipulated me, the way he had slowly eroded my control over our lives. I told the jury about the changes to the will, the financial transactions that didn't add up, and the car that I now knew had been tampered with. I didn't leave anything out. I told them everything, every detail that had been hidden, every piece of evidence that had been overlooked. But the most important part of my testimony came when I described what happened after I woke up. The days I spent in that bed, unable to move but fully aware, listening to Michael's conversations with Elena, the way they thought they were in control, the way they believed I would never wake up to expose their lies. "I heard everything," I said, my voice steady, unwavering. "I heard every word. I heard Michael's plans. I knew what he was doing, even when I couldn't move. He thought I was too weak to fight back. But I wasn't. I'm here today because I fought. I fought for my life. And now Michael Matthews has to answer for what he did." The room was silent after my testimony. The jury, the prosecution, even Michael sat there, absorbing the gravity of what had just been said. There was no more room for doubt. The truth had been laid bare, and Michael had nowhere left to hide. The defense tried to salvage his case, attempting to paint me as unreliable, questioning my memory, but it was too late. The evidence, my testimony, and the unwavering support from Detective Morris and the rest of the team had sealed his fate. Michael's desperate attempts to deflect were no longer enough to save him. As the trial continued, Elena's facade began to crumble as well. She, too, was caught in the web of lies she had helped weave, and when it was her turn to testify, she cracked under the pressure. Her story faltered, and in the end, she made a deal with the prosecution, offering to testify against Michael in exchange for a reduced sentence. It was over. Both of them were going down. The verdict came quickly. Guilty on all counts. Michael Matthews was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Elena received a reduced sentence of 15 years, but it was nothing compared to the life sentence Michael now faced. As I sat there in the courtroom, hearing the judge pronounce the final verdict, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It wasn't just about the punishment they would face. It was about reclaiming my life, my truth, and my future. Michael had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, he had only succeeded in making me stronger. The battle had been long, but justice had been served. And now I could finally begin to rebuild. The days following the trial were filled with a strange mix of relief and reflection. The courtroom had felt like the final battleground, the last place where Michael's lies could be exposed. But even after the verdict, there was an emptiness that I hadn't anticipated. Michael was gone, his plot unraveled, and Elena's betrayal laid bare for all to see. Yet, as I stood at the edge of this new chapter in my life, I couldn't help but feel the weight of everything I had endured. I had spent so long trapped in a world of silence, of forced inaction, that now, when I finally had the freedom to breathe, it felt foreign. The chaos of the last few months, the fear, the anger, the determination, was behind me, but the echoes still lingered. I had won, yes, but the scars of betrayal, of manipulation, were not so easily erased. The world around me was shifting, just as I was. The foundation, which had once been a symbol of my passion, was now a living, breathing testament to my survival. The work I had begun, the research, the advocacy, all of it now had new meaning. It wasn't just about advancing neurology anymore. It was about creating something that could stand as a beacon of hope for others who had been betrayed, who had been silenced, who had fought to reclaim their voice. I threw myself into the work with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that my journey wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every patient, every family who had suffered in silence, who had been manipulated in ways they couldn't even begin to understand. But there were still moments of quiet, moments when I'd find myself lost in thought, remembering how it all began, how easily I had trusted, how blindly I had believed in the person I loved. Michael had been the one person I thought I could depend on, the one person I thought would never betray me. And yet, he had done the unthinkable. I had been naive, yes. I had ignored the signs, dismissed the subtle manipulations, convinced myself that everything was fine because I wanted to believe it. But now, as I looked back, I understood something I hadn't before. Survival isn't just about overcoming the immediate danger. It's about learning from it, about using the scars to grow stronger. And I had learned. I had become stronger. I had built a life from the ashes of betrayal. The woman who had once been trapped in that hospital bed, unable to move, unable to speak, was now someone entirely different. I had learned the hard way that silence isn't always an enemy. Sometimes, it's the quietest moments that give you the power to see everything more clearly. My silence had been my weapon. My patience had been my strength. The hardest part of all of this wasn't the trial, the legal battle, or even the recovery. It was learning how to trust again. Trust had been taken from me in the most painful way imaginable, and now I had to rebuild it from the ground up. Every new relationship, every professional connection, every personal interaction was a test. But I was learning to be cautious without being cynical, to open up without losing myself again. Karen had become a true friend. She was more than just a nurse. She was a lifeline. She had seen through the facade, understood the importance of what I was doing, and had stood by me every step of the way. She had been there in the darkest moments, a quiet ally, and she became the person I trusted most in the world. Detective Morris, too, had become someone I relied on. She wasn't just the investigator who had helped bring Michael to justice. She was a symbol of everything I had been fighting for. In a world full of deception, she had been one of the few who truly saw the truth and fought for it. I still remembered her words when she first stood in front of me, her voice steady as she promised, "You're not alone in this, Sarah. We're going to make sure you get the justice you deserve." And she had kept that promise. As for the foundation, it became something even greater than I had ever envisioned. With the support of my allies and the unwavering dedication of the team that had stood by me, we began to shift our focus. The work now had a personal mission. It wasn't just about advancing research. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. It was about ensuring that no one else had to suffer the way I had. But the journey didn't end there. I realized that my experience, as painful and harrowing as it had been, was not unique. There were so many others out there. Women, men, families who had been silenced, who had been betrayed in ways they couldn't fully understand, and who were too afraid to speak out. I had been one of them once, but now I had the power to change that, to create a world where silence was no longer an option. There were still hard days, of course. There were moments when I found myself staring out the window, lost in thought, remembering what I had lost, what I had almost lost. But there were more moments now, more often, when I looked at the work I was doing, the people I was helping, and I knew that I had found a new purpose. The darkness had been all-encompassing for so long, but now there was light. And it was in that light that I found my strength, my resolve, and my future. The truth had been uncovered. The lies had been exposed. And now it was my turn to move forward. The hardest battles had been fought. The hardest lessons learned. But the real victory, I knew, wasn't in the courtroom or in the punishment that awaited Michael. It was in the peace I had finally found, in the knowledge that I had taken back control of my life, and that nothing, not even betrayal, could take that from me again.